presentation. So you might have an announcement there. So with that, and thanks for the folks who are introducing themselves in the chat, I am going to turn it over to my colleague Andrew Tuttle to give some brief framing remarks around our approach, and then we'll dive into some of the resources.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Robin. Andrew Tuttle here, director with the Ceres water team. I did just join Ceres about 3 months ago after about 20 years in portfolio management and portfolio analytics. And at Ceres, decidedly, sustainability is our bottom line. You know, we are a nonprofit organization. We do work with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the greatest problems out there. We have programmatic teams focused on climate change, water, capital market systems, and a just and inclusive economy. And through our networks of investors, companies, and nonprofits, you know, we drive action and inspire market-based and policy solutions throughout the economy to build a just and sustainable future. So on the next slide, I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of the risks and the world's freshwater supplies face, whether it's scarcity or pollution. And water stewardship has really never been as important as it is right now. I'm sure you see these headlines daily in Australia and New Zealand around the economic impact, the impact on human flight or human capital, social impact. It's on a daily basis, and this has been going on for years. And on the next slide, we'll see certainly in Asia, the semiconductor industry is a focus, certainly with production supplies down worldwide, impacting the prices of laptops, new cars, basically touching every tentacle of the global economy. And a lot of it has to do simply with the drought in Southeast Asia. So what do we do about all this? Well, on the next slide, you know, we've created the Investor Water Hub, which is the only open source global investor platform dedicated to generating awareness of water risks as well as actionable opportunities. You can see the geometric growth of the membership in this platform. Since 2015, we now, you know, house over 140 institutional investors representing over 30 trillion in AUM with, you know, the advisory committee, some members that you see here, CalSTRS, Impacts, the Park Foundation, PRI, and more. So I'll turn it back to Robin here. There will be a quick poll on the Investor Water Toolkit and the familiarity that you might have with it. And then Robin's going to dive into some more of those elements in more granularity.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And I am going to get the poll going. You can see this question that we're posing just before we get started so we can get a sense of the familiarity that folks have with the Investor Water Toolkit. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And 3 options. I think I might have set this as a multiple choice, but just choose one. So you've used the toolkit in your work. Maybe you've heard of the toolkit, but you feel like you need to learn more before you can use it. Or maybe this is a brand new resource for you. So all are welcome. Lots of poll results coming in. I'm going to give it 5 more seconds, and I will end the poll and share back out with you so you can see, you know, in general where folks are coming up. So thanks all. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So just quick tech check, can you all see the results here? Yeah, so it seems like for a lot of you, this is a relatively new resource. That's wonderful to hear. And I'm so glad you're on this call. And then some of you have maybe heard of the toolkit, but want to learn a little bit more about it. So you're in the right place for this overview. And I do see one of you has used the toolkit before, which is really great to hear. So no matter where you're coming from, I hope that this can be a useful overview for you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll. Let me close that out for now, but we will do another poll further on. But we will now dive into the Investor Water Toolkit itself. So as Andrew shared, we had the Investor Water Hub for a number of years as a peer learning environment. And through the Investor Water Hub, Ceres worked with 40 of our hub members to launch the Ceres Investor Water Toolkit in 2017. And it really is a roadmap for investors to understand how to engage with water risk. It includes 5 content-based sections and a sixth section with 10 case studies that highlight some of the ways that investors are applying methods, data sets, and innovative approaches to looking at water. And I'm gonna make sure I spotlight myself. There we go. So I'll be providing some examples of case studies throughout this. But first, you may be wondering, how do I even get to the toolkit itself? So the toolkit is an online resource. It's free and open for anyone to access. And there are 2 ways to get started. The first step, you can just search in your browser for Ceres Investor Water Toolkit, or we will be sharing a link to access afterward, and we can share that in the chat. But upon entering the toolkit, you will be brought to a quiz that you can take, and I encourage you to take it as it may help guide you to what section you may be best to start with in the toolkit. And then the next step is that you will see a screen like the one on the right in this slide, which contains both a really helpful short video explaining the toolkit, as well as those 5 different content sections and the 6th section on the case study. So each of those plus signs on there will break out the different sections within the toolkit. So now I'm going to share a few examples of what's actually in the toolkit. First is an example from our Understanding Water Risks section, and it's from the Florida State Board of Administration, which oversees the assets of the Florida State retirement system in the United States. And this is an example of an investor starting to evaluate water risk by looking at their exposure. A Ceres colleague of mine now, Hugh Brown, actually wrote this case study while he was an analyst with the Florida SBA. And he developed a portfolio water footprint using data from MSCI and FactSet to visually represent the water risk exposure of a $15 billion US passive portfolio within the fund. And what they found is that prioritizing water risks could provide them as an asset owner with a practical starting point for an ESG integration conversation. This footprint output, as you see, actually looks much more like a heat map, and it can help assist with decision making, such as a buy-sell decision, or perhaps decisions to hold or engage with a company. There's actually a really great, more recent example of a water footprint from BNP Paribas that we can also share out in the chat later on. So next, it's also useful to look at sector and industry specific information. So in the buy-sell analysis section, we have this data set where you can see a snapshot of where water risks may lie within the operations of a company, the supply chain of the company, or the product use or end of life for several different sectors. So this is there's a whole Excel sheet behind this little snapshot you see on the slide. And this research was done in conjunction with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, and also think it's a great starting point for investors to map water risks to industries in their portfolios. The water footprinting, as we mentioned, is a tool that's really helpful for portfolio managers. So for those of you on the line in that role, it can help identify investment risks, the industries or companies that may require deeper research. But it also can provide some insights into aggregate water risk exposure by industries. And so this slide shows a case study that Ceres conducted analyzing water risk exposure across 4 major indices using, again, SASB's materiality map to assign a water risk exposure score to each industry. So what we found is that more than 50% or more than half of each of these 4 industry holdings were found to be exposed to medium to high water risks. And this shows that water can really be a very material issue for portfolio managers. So moving moving more to a specific company level analysis, we have this water risk dashboard in the engagement section, which came to us from Piet Klopp at PGGM in the Netherlands. And this, we think, may be a helpful guide for any of you active or looking to improve your corporate engagement and stewardship programs. So there's three main elements in this dashboard. One is on water resource dependency. The second is on water resource security. And then the third is on a management's response. And these all interact with each other, and they can amplify or dampen a company or entity's overall risk exposure. So there's much more in the toolkit explaining how you can apply this to your own framework, but there's just some simple questions here that the water risk dashboard can help be a guide to when you might be having a more detailed conversation with a company involving water. And then getting into more of some of the nitty-gritty tools, again, in our buy-sell analysis section, we have a database where we keep track of the various metrics, maps, tools, and research platforms that all are able to reference water risk in some way. So we think about it almost as a one-stop shop if you're thinking about a vendor or platform that you might want to use. So on this slide, you can see a subset of the database showing some of the more water-specific related tools and platforms out there. And there's a full database that you can download with an Excel sheet that has over 30 tools and resources. And we think this is a great guide to find what you need for the specific asset class that you're working with or asset classes. So of the existing tools, we know that several are popular and useful among investors. So we'll can highlight some of those. There's the Ecolab Smart Water Navigator. It's a free tool. It was also known as the Water Risk Monetizer, and they recently updated it. So it's really great for those of you beginning to identify baseline water risk, as well as those of you who may be ready to track more year-over-year performance, and it has some basic benchmarking functionalities. And then there's two mapping related tools that investors often find useful. There's one from the World Resources Institute called Aqueduct, and there's another from the World Wildlife Fund called the Water Risk Filter. They've both gotten various updates over the past couple of years, aligning with TCFD and scenario analyses and other aspects that make them even more useful to investors. And then I want to note that there's a few new tools that have come up in the past year or so that have also signaled that they would love to hear from investors around their utility. So if you're interested in any of these, you can find information about them in this data set, and you can also reach out to Andrew or myself to help make a connection. But one is called Water Loop, and it's a water risk quantification tool that really gets at recommendations for a local basin level. So it's really focused on the local situation, the local context, which I know might be of interest to many of you on the call. And then another platform is called Water Plan, and it's an emerging tool that's designed to help both companies and investors better quantify, mitigate, and adapt around water security risks. So they are doing their best to consolidate all the existing corporate water data that lives in various platforms like CDP Water, a company's reporting, alignment with TCFD, and to bring it together into a variety of dashboards that investors can use. So exciting developments on that front. And then another resource to leave you with before we turn back to some Zoom polling is that we do keep a database of investment policy statements, belief statements, as well as proxy voting guidelines that mention water. And this is all found in the established priorities section. And it's to serve as a guide if you're newer into the water space or you have yet to explicitly mention water in some of these guiding documents. And so we know that these can be really foundational in helping guide your investment behavior. So wanted to make sure we promoted this resource especially. So for the investment policy statements, we have a database of more than 70 examples of how investors, asset owners, pension funds, many others are incorporating water within their policy or belief statements. And then we also have, for proxy voting guidelines, more than 40 examples of ways that investors are including water into those guidelines. So with that, we are going to pause and go back to some Zoom polling. And thanks to those of you who are introducing yourself in the chat. Really like to see that interaction. So this next polling question that I will put up for all of you is just getting a sense. We've shared some resources with you. Would be glad to hear what of these are ones that you might go to review later. So I'm going to launch that poll. You should see that come up. And I believe you can check as many as you want. So if there's multiple that you think you're going to go back to or that you'd like to explore some more, this is just some helpful feedback for us. So we'll give folks a moment to think on that. No commitment by any means, but want to just get some feedback on what you think was useful, what one of those resources might resonate with you. Great, we'll give it another 5 or 10 seconds. So we've got some good numbers coming in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and then we'll share it back out so you can see what's of interest. So really interesting to see that the water footprint case study is of interest there. Some of you liked the corporate water risk dashboard, some of the databases. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Yeah, asking, is there metrics that would be more suitable to the property industry? Yeah, that's a great question. There are, yeah, that's something I can follow up with you. I know that there is this resource called Core Logic that is in our database now, and they do have some focus on real estate. So that would be interesting to see if what they provide might be useful to you. So all their information is in that database. It's called Core Logic. Great. And then also I'm going to stop sharing the poll for now, but curious to hear from folks. I know we have, this is definitely catered a little bit more to those who are based in Australia, New Zealand, and in Asia, hearing a little bit more about the toolkit. Are there any thoughts on new ways that, as Andrew and I think about iterating and adapting the toolkit, are there ways that we can change that and make that more accessible to you all? So open invitation in the chat there, and I'm going to get our next poll going just to get a sense of from you all, what would help you use the toolkit more? So it sounds like for a lot of you, this is either a new resource or you'd like to learn more about it. So, and this is, I think, will be helpful for both, well, and all Ceres, AIGCC, IGCC, you know, are there certain ways that we can share this information with you? So I'm going to launch the poll, and I believe this is also one where you can share multiple, you can click multiple. So, you know, some ways it, and I've called this pathways, but a bit of a compass or a navigation through the Investor Water Toolkit, depending on the type of investor you are. Would you do better with more of like a customized one-on-one call, more informational webinars like the one that we're hosting today, or thinking about ways that we can improve some of the content that could be more of a geographic specificity? So seeing some good polling coming in. We might give it maybe 10 more seconds if you haven't answered yet. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll and share the results. So yeah, this is really helpful. So a lot of you are thinking having more of that geographic context could be really helpful. So that's certainly great to hear. And then, you know, knowing a bit more of that pathway, you know, how would you navigate through the toolkit depending on who you are? That's really helpful. And Andrew, any thoughts, any reactions from you before we transition to Eric?
Yeah, I do see a lot of great questions in the chat around, specifically assessing water risk in supply chains, specific to the apparel industry. And we do have some thoughts on those. We talked about the metrics that might be specific to the property industry, and there is kind of a cutting edge research that we are doing with a parallel kind of effort to address and model and estimate some of those things. So I think we'll touch on those in a little bit. But a lot of, I think what it seems like in the chat that people are looking for more granularity, whether it's geographic or industry based or company based or supply chain based. And I think that there are some great developments in that that we can touch on in a little bit.
Great. And I do see a question, a hand raised. I think we probably have time for maybe a question or two before we transition to Eric. So Seiji, if you, let's see, I think.
This is Kawazu from Sumitomo. Thank you very much for having a call today. I just want to ask you about how do you sort of align yourself with the new framework called TNFD? TNFD is the one of the natural capital related financial disclosure. And so separate from the climate change related TCFD, TNFD is one of the biodiversity natural capital related disclosure. And how do you sort of relate that framework to your analysis going forward? Because I think the TNFD would make it very, very sort of significant impact on the corporate disclosure in the future. And obviously water risk is one of the part of that natural capital component.
Yeah, thank you for raising that question. And we will touch on some of this work with the Valuing Water Finance Initiative, and we are aligning where we can with the TNFD. So maybe if we can hold that thought until we get to that. But yeah, it is, there's so many different initiatives and so many frameworks out there. So we're trying our best to align where we can. And I think that's this work that we're doing with the Valuing Water Finance Initiative is, I think, going to be a part of that. But yeah, and also welcome, ideas on ways to collaborate. Great. Well, I think at this point, we will transition presentation to Eric Niche from Manulife to share a bit about how Eric approaches water risk and decision making, and then we will open back up for questions before wrapping. So.
Great, thanks, Robin. Can everyone hear me okay? And can everyone see the screen?
Great.
Yes, yep.
Great, thank you. So what I thought we could share was just a real case study that we've been working through this year, and in many ways continue to work on. And then how, as we were looking at that, we used the water toolkit to help with that. So and this is it's pretty well covered and well known example, because semiconductors have been in the press quite a bit recently. But it kind of started with the secular trend of digitization, which has been around for a number of years. But then COVID-19 hit, and everyone found themselves on remote calls like this, Zoom calls, using their laptops, calling family, and that maybe you couldn't visit family and friends on cell phones, and maybe spending more time on game consoles or in front of the TV. At the same time, everybody was using, saving money from commutes and maybe dining out and things like that. And so when people had more money to spend, or maybe they got a stimulus check, it went towards a new tablet or a new TV. And so that really drove demand for semiconductors. Then we had a whole series of pretty unpredictable physical risks. So with climate change, the temperatures between the equator and the poles, were changing that dynamic, and we got colder temperatures than we'd ever seen in Texas in particular, which caused a lot of things to freeze, pipes to break. Particularly the big US semiconductor manufacturers had to disrupt a number of their operations exactly at the time that they really wanted to be ramping up to meet this demand. There was also a relatively unpredictable fire with a manufacturer in Japan that took out more supply. So for some of the other producers, especially the producers in Asia, of semiconductors, this should be a really great opportunity. So we started looking at our portfolios. I think anyone that invests in Taiwan is kind of constantly looking at this sector, but we thought, okay, now might be a good time to kind of scale up our weights and our exposure to some of these companies. So without naming any names, there were some companies that we started to take a bit of a closer look at. So what then did we need to be mindful of from an ESG perspective? This seems like this great thesis. What could go wrong, because apparently everything is going wrong. And so if you look at the materiality map on the Water Hub, you can just go straight to semis and see that they actually carry a lot of water risk. So in particular, they use a lot of water quantity. The quantity and volume is very, very high, and it needs to be very high quality. So, if you look into all of the other resources on the toolkit, you can see that makes a lot of sense. So semiconductors and computer chips are essentially all of these tiny little metal pieces that are connected, and they have to be very, very clean. So you can't have like a little stray metal wire that gets in the components, and then it's making connections that aren't supposed to be there, and the chip doesn't work. So you need to have ultra pure water that's constantly being used to wash every part as these really complicated chips are getting put together, and that takes a lot of water purification, and then also a ton of water quantity. And so then so how do we assess that? So we've decided that we're looking at Taiwan. We see this opportunity in Taiwan. Where can we find more data about water risk in Taiwan? And so you can look at those tools that Robin mentioned. A ton of them are free. You can look at if the snapshot isn't enough, you can go into a bunch of detail in the Excel workbook to really get a better sense of which ones or multiple tools you want to use. And so this shows just one example. You could pick Aqueduct and look at the what does it seem like the water risk is in Taiwan. And here it's orange, that's kind of medium risk. So okay, maybe there is something here that we need to worry about. And then with kind of talking to the local teams and some broker checks, we found that this medium risk is probably representing what's all year round, and it's very seasonal. So Taiwan is semi-arid. It's really dependent on the rainy season, which usually comes in May and June. And I know there's other investors on the call who probably know a whole lot more about this than I do. So Sophia or others, feel free to jump in. But usually it begins to rain in May or June, and then the typhoons come and they fill up the reservoirs. And so last year there was no typhoon, so the reservoirs were running really low to begin with. And then with climate change and changing precipitation patterns, there's basically the worst drought in 100 years. So Taiwan began to run out of water, and we began to look at this as a even more serious risk. How is this going to be a problem for our investment thesis? And so we talked to a couple of companies. Some of them said that they had put in place measures that would take them through June, and that they were very careful about managing water, and were basically responding to this. And so here's, and the toolkit has a whole bunch of ideas about this too. So when you go engage with the company, what does good water stewardship look like? What are the practices that we can ask these companies about, or ask them to be putting in place? And so this is the practices from one of the very large companies. Another really interesting connection to physical risk is in Taiwan. Taiwan has earthquakes, and so the buildings typically have to be, the general kind of rule of thumb is 1/3 of buildings gets built underground in the foundation for the top 2/3, just to keep everything stable. And so they have to dig really deep. So, if there's a skyscraper that's 100 meters tall, then it needs to go 30 meters underground. So this particular company began trucking water from construction sites where they were digging down into the ground as one of their management kind of practices, at the same time that they were really doing a lot of water recycling to ease the burden on the reservoirs. And so this was something that we at first in kind of April, May, we got, even March, we got reasonably comfortable with, that they were, putting in place enough practices to stem the risk. We also felt like there were smaller companies that maybe didn't have as good practices, so we were differentiating there. And then there's kind of maybe a bit of a bright spot at the end, where some of the seasonal rains came in. Taiwan kind of got brushed by a tropical storm, and it eased some of this water pressure. But they're probably not entirely out of the woods. It's something that we're continuing to watch. There's the whole physical risk aspect of, they need to have a typhoon that's going to really refill the reservoirs, but that brings with it a whole host of other physical risks. And then you can see that it's continuing to have effects this is particularly the used car market. So the delays from the semiconductor production and the inability to ramp up as much as they would have wanted to take this market share is slowing the release of new cars and increasing the demand for used cars. So it's in many ways, it's something that's, we don't have all the answers. It's still ongoing. It's still something that we're watching. And so I think in retrospect, you have, it's such an interesting case study, because you have all these interconnections of different physical risks, from climate change to fires and droughts and ice storms, playing out around the world. And really, it's, we can try and get a sense of these things, but it's really unpredictable. And to me, it really underscores the systemic nature of these risks. So the importance of putting these good practices in place before they happen, because water scarcity is only going to become an increasing challenge. And so again, I think there's some fantastic resources on the Water Hub for what kinds of questions or things we could look at.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric, for sharing that perspective. I think I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, so we'll have some time for questions before we wrap up. So let me do that.